Good morning again, everybody. Ani Bonjour. My name is Jeff Lykes. I'm the interim executive director for the First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council of BC. And welcome to another in our series of webinars around this whole process of housing and infrastructure. Today's webinar is called The Business of Housing. You notice that to be a slight change from what we normally have been talking about a lot over the last couple or 3 years around housing as a business. We wanted to change the conversation today and talk more about the business of housing. And we have three great panelists with us today. Jason Calla, who you'll remember from having been here in the past. I'll introduce each of them a little more in depth, a little more in a few moments. But Jason was with one of our previous webinars. We brought him back for a repeat performance. We have Kim Baird with us. And again, I'll do more of an introduction on Kim in a few seconds. And our third panelist today is Andrew Leach. And again, I think all of you would probably be well familiar with all three of these individuals and their involvement in First Nations and First Nations housing, infrastructure, politics, etc. Over the many years. As we try to and normally do on all of these, we would want to start our session off today in a good way. And so to do that, we've asked one of our regional engagement coordinators, Doug Harris, to start us off with a prayer and a song. So Doug, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Aichka. I native see it, na see it, yeah. Good morning, dear respected friends and relatives. Stestes ja wenst, see it, na selchwan, na see it, yeah. Na eli schwatlaqua, hai tsepka, and the kwasialip, atana quail. I yatsot, Titi Watsalt. Ti will sensei. Chi will sensei. Chi will sensei. Oh, Heichka, Tita Siam, Tana Quail. Oh, Tita Siam, Tea Humi Amish, that not so much squallow and a Tana Quail. Oh, Tita Siam, Tea Humi Hawkwishers, that not so much squallow and a Tana Quail. Eat a muck squail. Scotland, stat. Heichka. Heichka.
Very much, Doug. Thank you very much. Okay, today we have, I want to start with just a couple of little things about this webinar before we just get into all of the, into our speakers. A couple of housekeeping items. The webinar will run till about 11 o'clock BC time, sorry, 12 o'clock BC time. I'm looking at my clock here. I'm sitting in Ontario. I'm in the Treaty 20 area in Ontario, and as a citizen of Hiawatha First Nation, so I'm playing with a 3-hour time difference. So my apologies if I start quoting the wrong time, but we'll be about an hour. There'll be presentations from each of our three speakers, after which we'll have a question and answer period. If you look at the bottom on the status line of the Zoom webinar screen, you'll see a Q&A box there. If you have questions, please feel free to ask them as we go along. Put them into the box and we'll bring them up as we can, either during the presentations or right after each presenter has spoken, or in the more formal question and answer period which follows. Our first speaker today is Jason Calla. We want to get Jason covered right away, and if you have any questions for Jason, I would encourage you to ask them during his presentation or as soon as possible thereafter. Unfortunately, Jason has to leave us today at 10:30. And so he has to step away for a few moments. He'll probably and hopefully be back later in the session, but we told him that we try to get questions to him before he leaves. So our first speaker, as mentioned, is Jason Calla. He's worked with First Nations over 2 decades, served 3 terms as Secretary Treasurer for the First Nations Health Authority and Chair of its Finance and Risk Committee. He's advised on options and participated in a number of major resource projects. He's worked on comprehensive community plans, including financial analysis, First Nations fiscal governance positions, and in different infrastructure, finance, and development scenarios. Jason completed a BCom from University of British Columbia in '94 and an MSc, a Master's of Science from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1998. And Jason is a proud member of Squamish First Nation. So I'll turn it over to you, Jason, and start our conversation on the business of housing.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeff, for the introduction. And I do want to say thanks to Doug for starting our meeting in a good way. Really pleased to have the opportunity to speak and be here with Andrew and Kim as well. So I know I got to step away, but I think you're going to be recording these. You tend to as well, right, Jeff? So
yeah.
Okay, if I don't get to hear Kim and Andrew, will be able to see their recording after on your webpage. So the topic today of business and housing is like a really interesting one. I know I've been sort of thinking about it over the weekend, and this time of year we see lots of news stories that come out, I think, in the new year about what's happening with the real estate market in British Columbia. Where are housing prices going? What's the outlook for the number of housing starts? Housing is a big industry and big business in particularly in the Lower Mainland, but I think all throughout the province, with lots of employment opportunities through the trades, through the design, through finance. There's legal aspects, of course, to real estate development, and like I say, it's a big industry. A lot of private sector activity. We see that off reserve. When we come on reserve to our communities, though, I think we don't see as much private sector activity. So it's a bit confusing because there's a lot of demand, as we know, for housing from our members who would like to have a house in their community, and yet the supply is not maybe keeping up, with the demand. So it raises sort of questions about why can't we have more business, supporting housing? Why can't we develop the private sector to respond better? And I think to be a little bit boring and talk about economics for a little bit, private markets will tend to work well when certain assumptions hold. Those assumptions are things like, there's good information available to all the firms and individuals who are engaging in the market, that there's no external effects like pollution or congestion, that there's no natural monopolies, and that there's public goods aren't an issue. These are these standard assumptions of sort of efficient markets model. Unfortunately, and spoiler alert, these assumptions never hold. So you don't get efficient markets just on their own, really. And there's evidence, I think, that we see in lots of areas in Canada where there's government intervention and activity. There's a public education system. There's a public health system. There's a pension plan system. There's unemployment insurance. There's a whole range of government interventions. And of course, during this pandemic, we've seen the importance of government action, really clearly. It's been a huge thing that's affecting all of us with respect to health, for sure. These issues and these market failures, I think, are evident in the housing sector as well. And so when I think about, some of the things that we need to have a good private market system, or at least a balanced system, maybe we're not suggesting it should be private. At least I don't think there would be a single sort of private approach, a balanced approach with public housing, social housing, just different options for people to look at. You need to have good information. What does that mean when it comes to housing? Does that mean zoning? Does that mean building codes, safety codes, so we know that buildings are safe? We need to think about, externalities like pollution, like the types of land uses that are located close to one another for positive and negative reasons. We need to think about, the fact that there are natural monopolies, things like water and sewer systems. It's very difficult to have competing systems where you would, individuals would be able to purchase, make a selection from a different service providers. There's really going to be one service provider for a network of services like that. And things like public goods, like street lighting and public safety issues. There's a whole, I think, a range of things that affect the housing market and affect the ability of a housing market to function very efficiently. And we need good government intervention to be able to support more business activity with respect to housing. And I think about off reserve again. Local governments in this province, that there's rules that have been developed over time that have been modified, that we have a local government act, we have different levels of government. We have, in Metro Vancouver, there's the Vancouver Water District, the Sewerage District, there's TransLink, there's different levels of government offering different services to support and intervene where these market failures exist. When we come to on reserve, what do we see? Well, we've been constrained by the Indian Act for a long time. And there hasn't been a lot of innovation in terms of the ability of First Nation governments to have the tools to support better housing activity until probably recently, right? And we see different communities choosing different paths to try and exercise assert their jurisdiction over their land and do these things, like whether it's, Kim's community through the treaty process, or other communities through, the Land Management Act or the Fiscal Management Act. And I think even, of course, the BC Housing Infrastructure Council, is emerging as, what's its role going to be? How is it going to support better housing activity? And maybe some of these ideas, might be a bit of a framework to think through, what some of the roles and responsibilities might be to, have that good public sector support for those individuals and firms to engage in business and to increase the supply, of housing and housing options. So Jeff, maybe I'll just pause there and just see if you have any comments or questions.
Lesson number 1, unmute yourself. I have a couple, Jason, just to follow up, and then there was 1 or 2 that have been submitted here just on the Q&A side while we've been talking. The one question that comes to me is that you talked about the market models that exist off reserve in non-Indigenous communities. How do we create a market model for on reserve? What would that look like, and what sort of other institutions or businesses need to be created to get us there?
Yeah, that's great. Great question. And I think, that what I was mentioning, these sort of standard assumptions, like, because we probably will see failures with respect to information. Like, is there a strong role for example, an organization like BC Housing, Council, providing a bit more information about housing opportunities? Like, it may sound simple, just information, but it's very powerful to make markets work a little bit better. So, whether that's opportunities for employment, whether that's opportunities for companies to have development plans, whether that's opportunities or information about land use opportunities or development permit opportunities. I think information is a big part of it. I think nations assuming and asserting their jurisdiction with respect to their lands, in whatever form that takes. If that's a treaty, that's great. But what is the land use plan? What are the zoning guidelines? And that information, again, is really important, I think, not only for the proposed parcel that may be under consideration for development, but also the neighboring parcels, right? Like, you're going to make an investment in your home. It's a big investment that you're going to make. You're going to want to know that the neighborhood that you're going to be moving into, there's not going to be a, cement plant and nuclear power plant, put up next to you, right? You'd rather have a park and some open space, or, maybe a school, or, so understanding, I think, what the overall land use plan is really important. And of course, I would argue that infrastructure is a huge issue. Water and sewer, and as we're learning now, internet connectivity. We all need this. So, how is the First Nation government going to plan for that infrastructure? How is it going to develop a business case for the infrastructure? How is it going to establish a financial plan for how it's going to pay for that, which could be financing the cost of it over time? And how is the infrastructure going to be operated and maintained? I think that's key to supporting. We need service lots to be able to have houses, right? So I think some of those things, and certainly building inspections and building codes, and having really safe places, and having not only know that the residents know it's safe, but for fire safety, that's really important, of course, too. So I think some of these are kind of maybe boring things, Jeff, but some of those things really important to support businesses to be able to engage.
We've got another question here that we'll come back to later on, and it's one that I would just I'll pose to you, and then say to Kim and Andrew, something to think about when we finish up your piece of the presentation. But we've talked about the whole issue of home ownership on reserve and what that looks like. This part of the question on what is like smaller remote, how do we look at comparing and bringing the business of housing to smaller remote communities compared to where maybe much easier. So someone like, and Kim can maybe touch on this during her part, maybe easier next to the larger urban communities.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite. So it's about private housing finance and sort of in smaller communities. Is that the?
Well, just considering what you talked about the business of housing and the various elements that you were saying that were important, how does that get achieved? How does that work for a smaller, more remote community compared to maybe those communities who are closer to larger urban areas, or have those more accessible to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamentals are similar, right? And in a sense, I'm coming to you today from Esslahan, which is Squamish Nation Reserve here in North Van. The prices in North Van are insane, as with throughout the Lower Mainland, as we know. Like it's hard to figure out how people can afford to buy houses. We have for our community, there's a big housing list, and there's not enough lots for everyone to have a house. And on the one hand, it sounds great, I guess, in the sense of people who have a house, the value's high, but for those trying to get in, it's very, very, very difficult. So the land value, I would say, makes the problem more difficult. If you're in a smaller community that's maybe more remote, the land costs associated with home ownership may not be an issue, although the scarcity of land could still be, as counterintuitive as that sounds. I know nations who are, they've run out of room on their existing reserves because the reserves were allocated were not sufficient to allow for growth. So, but I think the other issues are still the same, Jeff. Like whether it's the information about what lots are available, the availability of service lots, the ability of an individual who may be interested in purchasing a house, if they want to build the house themselves and get a loan for the house, how much is it going to cost to build that house, and how can they spread that cost over time? Is there a housing loan program that could be in place? Because it's pretty hard to save up the amount of money that it would cost to build a house, so you tend to try and spread that cost out over time. But so I think those, regardless of whether you're in an urban center or whether you're in a more rural setting, some of the fundamental issues remain the same that I mentioned.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm gonna move on. Thank you. And I know that you may have to leave. Hopefully you're able to come back, and we'll save more of these questions for the end. Thanks, Jason. And we'll go to our next presenter now. And I'd like to introduce to everybody Kim Baird. And Kim is the owner of Kim Baird Strategic Consulting and offers First Nations related and strategic advice to industry, government, First Nations. She has a deep knowledge in relation to First Nations policy, governance, and economic development. as well as First Nation consultation, communication, and engagement issues. You will know from her previous role, Kim was the Chief Treaty Implementation Director and Chief Negotiator for Tsawwassen First Nation for 6 terms, from 1999 to 2012. Her most notable achievement was when she negotiated and implemented British Columbia's first urban treaty on April 3rd, 2009, leading Tsawwassen to self-government and enabling massive economic development on Tsawwassen lands. Kim is also someone who has been in receipt of many prestigious awards, including an honorary doctorate degree from Simon Fraser University, Kwantlen Polytech University
Read all
Distinguished Alumni Award.
that.
You want me to stop this?
Yeah, stop.
Okay, because a lot of distinguished awards from Kim. And so what I would like to do then is turn it over to Kim, someone who has vast experience in this area. And Kim, ask you to begin this conversation as well on the business of housing.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Doug for starting us off in a good way. Thanks to the Housing and Infrastructure Council for inviting me on this panel. And it's great to see both Jason and Andrew, who I know relatively well. I'm Kim Baird. My ancestral name is Quintiletana, which comes from my great-great-grandfather Quintilem, a former hereditary chief of my community, Tsawwassen. As well as consulting, I'm currently the Chancellor for Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and I do sit on some boards, including the Infrastructure Bank of Canada. When I was first invited for this panel, I thought, what is my housing experience? Because I'm kind of more of a generalist than a specialist, I'd say. But I guess from building my own house through ministerial guarantee a very long time ago, and as chief for 13 years with housing as my biggest frustration and failure politically, I would say. And most recently on a housing panel for Huu-ay-aht First Nations. And I like the topic about thinking big when we think about housing and the business of housing, because ultimately I think shelter is a human right. And the gap for decent housing for First Nation people is incredible. It's kind of overwhelming. And it's great that we're building institutions like the council to help advise on this. But I think we, in our communities, we can provide solutions all the way from governance and decision-making down to procurement and those sorts of activities. And speaking from my own experience, although housing programs like the CMHC one were an absolute disaster for my community, I don't think we should be stuck there. In fact, I think we've learned many lessons from those challenging models. On Indigenous matters, I think no one ever fixes things for us. So in my experience, it's best that we have our own strategies on how to move forward as First Nation communities. And if you think about it, like from planning to procurement and project management, policy development, maintenance, financing, enforcement, these are all issues where at least my community requires capacity to deal with housing. It's also an opportunity for us to build businesses to respond to this huge gap we have. In Tsawwassen, more recently, our staff and leadership have been thinking about the creation of a society to try and depoliticize housing issues and to administer provincial housing funding that's available. We've had the benefit of our treaty to do some master planning for infrastructure that looks out over the next 25 to 50 years and have developed economically to pay for that infrastructure. And recently I worked with Huu-ay-aht First Nations, which is a small remote community, on a housing panel where we took a 20 to 30 year look at housing needs for the community, set annual targets for houses, number of houses to be built, and looked at the infrastructure that would be required and the type of construction investment required. Now they have a much better idea of what their need is and what their targets are. And we recommended that they have a housing advocate position to work within their community so that they could work with Huu-ay-aht citizens to find their path for a house that looks at options from rental to ownership, etc. So that's just a few things to get people's ideas flowing and discussion started. But again, I think that the title of this webinar is correct. It is the business of housing. And because it's so much more than the dysfunctional program we had to administer when I was chief, I look forward to hearing Andrew's remarks and the discussion and questions. Thank you, Heichka.
Thank you, Kim. I just one quick question, if we could maybe expand on, you talked about creating a separate committee or a separate group to look at depoliticizing housing. How do you mean depoliticizing?
Yeah, so a arm's length nonprofit society to be responsible for some of the more controversial aspects of housing, whether it be allocating housing or enforcement of rental arrears or those sorts of things that really plague First Nation communities as far as politically challenging. So really trying to separate First Nation Council from the business decisions that need to be made to make a sustainable housing program. And as I said, there are other benefits, including providing a vehicle that can receive provincial housing funding and that kind of thing as well.
Well, thank you for that. Hold your thoughts, because we may have to come back to that as we get to the question and answer period again. Thank you, Kim. Our next speaker is Andrew Leach. Andrew is a proud member of Stopnik Nation. He's a lead organizer, or was the lead organizer for the first World Indigenous Housing Conference in Vancouver in 2012, and many of you might have remembered that or participated in that. He owns and operates a successful management consulting business here in British Columbia, specializing in First Nation leadership support, and has over 20 years of senior management experience with Indigenous organizations and Indigenous groups. So Andrew, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. Good to see you again. I'd like to thank the opening prayer with Doug this morning, as well as the organizers for this event. And of course, Jason and Kim, who I'm very happy and honored to share the floor with this morning. Okay, so I've got two quick stories to share with you about the business of housing. And I think these two stories capture the essence of my presentation. One summarizes the problem, and the other one, I think, summarizes the solution. So let's deal with the first story, story number one. As mentioned, I was the Chief Executive Officer for the Aboriginal Housing Management Association from 2007 to 2013. And one of the tasks that I was given during that time was to help organize and lead the first World Indigenous Housing Conference in Vancouver in 2012. We set our theme for that conference as sharing our stories and sharing our successes. I really like that idea of storytelling to illustrate the ideas. It had obviously a traditional context to it, and hence I'm going to use that for today. The reason why we want to talk about successes was because we could see that a lot of stories out there are about, how not to do housing. But what we really found a value is how to do it. And so that was where we focused on the successes. I had the absolute pleasure and honor to, over a 2-year period, to travel to United States, Australia, New Zealand, and visit the Indigenous people's housing operations there, really get to understand the successful ones down there, and actually work with the federal governments of all four to see how they interfaced with Indigenous housing providers. Yeah, of course, my phone would go off as soon as I started on this. What I wanted to say was over that 2-year period, by the time I got to the conference, it was clear to me what the root problem with Indigenous housing is, wherever you may be. Quite simply put, Indigenous housing providers lack meaningful control over their affairs, which results in poor outcomes, from planning to financing to development to operations. What really came from me in my experience in that capacity was just this simple motto: we can do better for ourselves than others can do for us. It really comes down to that. So this segues into my second story. And so you can see now over the past few decades, Canada and Native American tribal governments have been taking back more control over their. That control has led to better outcomes. I can't stress this enough. Getting more control over your lives has led to better outcomes. So, including in housing. And so my second story is about my recent experience as the Chief Administrator Officer for Tsleil-Waututh Nation over on the North Shore between 2015 and 2018. It was an absolute honor to work for that nation. They were a very successful, progressive First Nation. We had ample own source funding. And as a matter of fact, our own source funding was greater than the government funds we received every year. And so much of those funds came from housing, building houses, selling them, renting them, managing them, repairing them, building the infrastructure to support the housing, collecting taxes. We actually were quite successful in that area. And I'd say if you wanted to know the secret of it, it's leverage. So the one word I want to just emphasize with you, leverage, leverage, leverage. We leveraged our funds with government funds. We leveraged our rights. We leveraged our control of our own backyard. We leveraged our staff. We leveraged our time. And for me, I'd like to give you one example on this idea of leveraging. When you want to build a group of homes, some people think, oh, well, we need to just build some homes for sale to rent to the outsiders. Well, you can actually build them for both for your members and non-members by creating a mix of housing. And you are then able to leverage both resources that you would have, government resources and your own source funds. And by being able to leverage on just your development side, you can start creating greater opportunities. So I just want to be clear about this with my experience with housing, is that really this topic of business of housing has meaning when you can start developing and leveraging your own source of funds. Until then, you're just playing this poverty game. Kim had made a comment a few years back, and it's stuck with me since. And that was, you know, we got to shift from managing our poverty to managing our wealth. Hallelujah to that one, Kim. That's been with me for years now. And I've been saying that in the communities I've been going to. Let's start managing wealth, creating wealth and managing wealth, and getting out of this managing poverty by focusing on just government funds for the little that they can do for us. So there was a comment that was made a bit earlier about, you know, how can we do this in remote places, smaller communities and the like. And I agree that is a challenge, but by creating your own sourced funds of pool and being smart with that, you're going to be able to leverage those dollars. And you definitely can create the kind of things that are happening in the urban larger areas. I'll leave it at there. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Kim, I know that Jason has, I believe Jason has left. I'll double check to make sure, but I believe he has left us. So I'm going to turn to you two for most of the responses, some of the questions that will come in. There was a question that was posted earlier, and you both respond to that. Or certainly you have, Andrew, in your last comment about the urban versus rural locations and the challenge that brings. I guess what I'm wondering is, in both of your experiences, so I'll give each of you a chance to answer this. In both of your experiences, are there examples out there where First Nations are actually turning this paradigm around and talking about the business of housing and talking about how you do things such as you talked about, leveraging, depoliticizing, all of those various things. Kim has talked about what has happened in Tsawwassen, but are there examples out there that come to mind where there are communities that are doing that? And those that are, what are the elements, the key elements that are allowing them to have that success? So I don't know, Kim, would you like to start first, and then I'll turn it to Andrew?
Yeah, I guess when I was on this housing panel for Huet, I did a little bit of research about what was happening nationally, and there are little pockets of innovation on any one of these matters that we've listed, from financing to construction to all those things. So I think the opportunity now is to innovate, though, in that I don't think there's like a role model community that has done a template that would work for everybody. So I think it really depends on communities' priorities on where to focus. And I think it's also having a way of trying to inform funders like the province or CMHC of what our needs are as communities, to try and design some of those program innovations they're looking at. But it really depends from, you know, design, cultural design components to different funding models, different ways to invest in housing. There's a whole different range of examples out there, and Andrew might have more specific things that he can reference to than I can.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, again, I hate to, not to hate, but I like quoting other leaders on some of the things that just really summarize best what I think we need to do. And when I think about Clarence Louie's comment, we have to create a climate for success. I really think that's what we need to do here. It's what do we need to do to create the climate for success for our community, no matter where we are, urban, rural, small, large. And to me, the first thing I see when I see I've been in both, by the way, where the housing is a shambles and there's poverty abound and it seems like we're just spinning our wheels, and where we've been just moving on all cylinders and there's a lot happening. And you can see the climate and the difference of it in the one that's really moving along. Again, I've been in some remote, isolated places where this has existed. The laws are there that are able to provide for development, that are able to provide for those things to get off the ground. There are policies in place that are well defined and clear and unambiguous and up to date. The infrastructure is there to be able to do these things. Management, strong management. By the way, I love entrepreneurial managers. Those who are in government positions who can think outside of the box and say, hey, how might we be able to do this a bit differently? You get those kind of things, you're going to start creating that climate for success and to be able to do those things that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I was writing as you were talking because there were a couple of things that came to mind, and Jason made a comment earlier on. And I'll come back to a couple of the questions we've got, because I think you've answered some of the questions that were there. But just the question about, Jason talked about building public institutions. And he talked about things such as using some of the tools that are there for us, the Land Management Act, the First Nations Fiscal Financial Management Act, et cetera. What are the type of public institutions that we could probably or should probably be looking at that would help to develop the systems and the tools to make market housing successful? I'll start with you, Andrew, and I'll go back to Kim and give her a chance to think about it this time.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, can't just throw it at her first, right? So good stuff. Thank you. Okay, yeah, I guess, you know, these federal laws that we've created, the First Nations Financial Management Act, being able to do your own land codes, all those are absolutely critical. And for every senior manager out there, you should have a good understanding of what each of them mean and can do for your community. And so just do that. First Nations, federal laws, and you can just understand those ones. Then you can start working with those to seeing if they're able to be done in your community and how you might be able to go about them. And I've never heard anybody say to me yet, yeah, we put that in place and it was easy peasy. It got put installed really quick. Everybody loved it, and it was 100% referendum rate on it. It doesn't happen that way. I've seen many good places where it was actually a really good thing to get in place, but how they tried to implement it, it just was the wrong thing at the wrong time, and they're now 10 years weren't able to pass that. So not only understand what it might do for you, but also have a plan on how you might implement it and the timing so that you can do it. But the thing that I see for me, one of them is to be able to attract capital to your backyard. How do you go about doing that? Just think about it. Why would you want to put money into there? Whether you're a banker, an investor, a partner, a homeowner, it's got to have that climate for success again. So it has to have good infrastructure. It has to have good services to be able to provide. It's got to be reasonably safe. It's got to be a good price, all those kind of things. And those kind of laws and policies that we talked about are there. But if we took a funnel, I'd say those federal laws are probably the first one that you should look at and start thinking about getting established in your community. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Kim, your turn.
Yeah, I just want to say that you may think that because Tsawwassen in a more urban place that we should have an easier time with housing, but the barriers are huge from the individual level of being able to pay for rent or mortgage, as the case may be, to, I mean, as Andrew implied, everything about housing can be challenging. And so I think that the things we do have control over is how we make decisions, how we organize ourselves. And it is some of the toughest things you have to do, whether it be dealing with rental arrears and those things that are so politically volatile that can turn over a chief and council from one to another because it is so politically volatile. So I think it's important that we build our capacity and institutions in a way that, as I said earlier, depoliticizes some of this so that we get into more business approach for housing. And there are, I don't mean to be discouraging whatsoever, because I know how challenging housing is and how important it is for people. But we can only start where we have control over things. And I think that's a good starting place as we advocate to others, banks and governments, to assist the situation our communities are in my opinion. And I think we can also learn from others. Sometimes we can be a bit proprietary in our approach to these issues and don't reach out to others that have successes. But, you know, I think about some urban nonprofit housing societies that are working with First Nations now. They're sharing their capacity and expertise that they've built with off-reserve solutions and trying to bring that to communities to better operate housing programs. So there's lots that can be done. I think it starts with some vision and courage, however, would be my view.
Thank you. Some of the questions that have come in are asking some of those common issues and concerns that we've heard over the years. What it costs to build a home, the cost of construction, whether it's rural, remote, or urban, the whole issue of CP, certificates of possession, the no title to the land, the whole issues that surround the Canada's control and role in First Nations, and the whole issue of, as you just mentioned, Kim, capacity, and what is the capacity. So with all of those challenges, with all of those issues out there, what do you see as potentially a role for a new regional housing and infrastructure body? What do you see that role being, and what type of responsibility or involvement should it take on when it comes to the business of housing? Kim, do you want to start that?
Sure. I mean, I think with all the challenges we've listed, there is so much opportunity. It's kind of a matter of where you want to get started. But I think at a minimum, regional housing and infrastructure body can help with looking at best practices, with sharing information about different sources of funding or mortgages or different finance approaches. There could be, at a bare minimum, just a central place for information about best practices for whatever part of housing you're looking at. And I think that the issue First Nations have to deal with, not everyone has the capacity to try and update banks on better housing mortgage programs. So at some point, it may be a body of expertise that can help advance those sorts of matters. Or I mean, the possibilities are endless depending on who your members are and what they need as far as housing. But I think that working together and having someone with build expertise in this area could only benefit everyone that participates.
Good, thank you. Andrew, can you answer that one for us?
I can try, Jeff. Give you my 2 cents if you don't mind. I love the Native American Indian Housing Council model. Native American Indian Housing Council, NAIHC. So check it out. Quick story on it is the right-wing Republicans 30 years ago didn't like all this federal housing dollars they kept giving to the tribes. Wanted to find a way they could streamline this. And so the Native American tribes got together and said, well, we don't like you involved in our business either. It's not doing us any favors. So they came up with creating a national umbrella organization that could serve all of the Native American tribes and it not be the federal government. And what they ended up doing is devolving the responsibility from the equivalent of CMHC over to one Native tribe controlled body. And the first thing they did was they took those monies and were then said, what do you guys think we should do with this money? And the tribe said, keep your nose out of our business. Give us flexibility on these dollars rather than telling us in a narrow way what we should do with these dollars and what we can't do with them. And so then they also said, you know what, a lot of our communities, more remote, isolated ones, need capacity building. So we're going to create national training standards and start delivering them. And how they deliver it was pretty cool. They had a pretty small, tight staff in Washington, DC, and they just would ship them off, land at the airport in some place like Albuquerque, rent a hotel space near the airport, and those who were in that area would go to that place and get this training, this good training that they would deliver on a national basis. And so I think that's the key thing for a regional body, straight up, is get control of the responsibility by devolving the role of the federal government over to here. I don't think there's a better place in Canada to do that than BC, because we've had ample experience on devolving, and why not do it with this? And then also take a look at what type of training that we could provide all across the region that would allow for people to be able to build the capacity that's needed. So I'd start by looking at the Native American Indian Housing Council story and going from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody was kind enough to actually post, as you were speaking, post the link on the chat column, post the link to the website if anybody is interested in going and having a look at. The beauty of technology is that it comes out of your mouth and somebody's already covered your comments already, Andrew, with posting where we can find that. So thank them for that. There's one question here that's come in that's a little different than what else is being asked. And I would just, it's sort of off the topic a little bit. The question that has to do with multi-residential housing on reserve, and how that could be used perhaps in a community to create elders, to allow them to stay and age in place, help maybe to reduce infrastructure or whatever. What role do you think from the whole business and housing aspect would a multi-residential housing have versus the single family? Because obviously the model seems to be, for most communities, let's build single family. Andrew, do you want to pick up and carry on with that one, and I'll come to Kim next?
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so yeah, I'd mentioned earlier about the importance of mix, creating the housing mix, right? And leveraging both sides. And I did get a little bit of this from my AMA experience, where they were an off-reserve entity, but they were creating mixes. They'd go to the city like Vancouver and say, we'd like to get this property. Developer always wanted to get the maximum that he could, but he said, no, no, just hold on. In order for this to work, we're going to designate some of these homes for low-income housing, other types of housing, and we want, say, 10% of 5% of the units to be for that. And if that's the case, then we can go ahead and move forward. So that would be a model that I would consider for us to be able to do too. We have, if we have decent enough infrastructure, created a climate for success, developers will be knocking on our door. And what we're going to say to them is, you're not going to be able to build all your units and maximize. We're going to set aside 5% that we're going to do what we're going to do with it and create that as part of our pool. And if you can start doing stuff like that, again, leveraging, you can start not only bringing those types of units in your place and keeping your community's members there, but it could be subsidized by some of those for-profit ventures. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Kim?
Yeah, when I was on this panel for Huu, it was good to think about all forms of housing, and the single family is just one of very, very many models. In that, like, you think about transition housing for people that have various needs. Mother centers is another form of, that's different than what we're used to. And I think it makes a lot of sense for having, I mean, in our community, we have a sixplex for our elders. And some of these projects, if they're planned properly, you know, you have one roof instead of 6 roofs in that case. So there's economies of scale. I think you can also try and provide supports in that case. The example for elders where there's a bit of a center that can have a whether it be a clinic or something to help elders age in place, some supports. So that's the exact type of thinking I think communities need to make in relation to their housing strategies. And sometimes rental stock is something communities need. Younger people who don't have a big family yet, or single people who don't have families, everyone needs different housing scenarios. So I think, you know, we should be very creative when we think about needs, even though it's hard to match that up with what programs are offered sometimes. But yeah, I think there is a role for all kinds of housing in our communities.
Thanks, Kim. I'm going to jump now to a comment that Andrew actually made earlier on that he credits obviously to you about managing wealth versus managing poverty. So when we talk about the business of housing and we talk about managing wealth, what do many of the First Nations need to look at to start creating that wealth or generating that wealth to be able to use that from Andrew's examples earlier on leveraging, being able to find own source revenues or being able to leverage funding, staffing, et cetera, to create those kind of things? What does that look like when you talk about managing wealth versus managing poverty?
You want me to start?
Yeah, go, yeah. It's your quote, so I'm asking.
Well, it's a much different thing, a much different set of problems to look at, right? So when you're managing poverty and you're managing mostly federal funding and not much else, you don't have a lot of decision-making ability over what gets funded. As soon as you have some discretionary funding, it's a new set of problems because we have so many needs, right? So how do you prioritize them? And whether it be infrastructure or programs, in my community, people like per capita distributions, which are really expensive and don't leave much of a legacy in my opinion, but it is what it is. That's the reality that our leadership has to manage. And so what do you prioritize? Is it education? Is it housing? In some ways it's like, what fingers on your hand do you want to keep when you're thinking of these matters, right? Because it's all important. So it's a huge shift into sort of thinking about how to best manage any income you are making and invest in what your community needs. And in our case, we've done like so much economic development, our infrastructure that set us up for a very long term. We've done master planning to look at long-term needs, and we're now getting to things like, now that we've dealt with water and sewer, and it took us decades to be able to do that, other forms of community infrastructure. I was never so happy to see a sports field open in our community, where I had dreamed about that for my whole term as chief, but we just did not have the revenue to invest in anything like that. So again, it's a different set of problems to have, but you need to shift about what your gaps are and what is important to your community, I guess.
Okay, thank you. I'm cognizant of time. We have a couple of minutes, so this is the last question for each of you to consider. And I think you've covered it. In fact, I know you've covered it in your various responses over the course of, and in your presentation over the course of the webinar today. But I'd like you to just, if you could, in a quick summary, tell us what steps you would recommend to achieve the end goal of housing being a self-sustaining success, that the business of housing is successful. What, if you could, and say 5 steps or whatever, what are the steps you would say are required to achieve success? Go ahead, Kim.
Geez, I think you should have asked Andrew first.
Okay, I'll ask Andrew first. Give you a chance to think about it.
That's good. Okay, no problems. Thanks, Kim. Appreciate that. I actually was writing down my reply to the past question and came up with almost like a 4 or 5 step process. So good thing, Jeff, that works well with my answer. First of all, number 1, go after your low hanging fruit. Okay. Any community I've gone into, I hear a lot of, we should do this, we should do that. You have to sequence the things that you're wanting to do in the proper order. You can't go after the mega $1 million project when you're have barely any money in your account. But there's some low-hanging fruit that's lying around that you can go after and start generating some activity, some return, and some confidence in what you're doing. Okay. Once you've got those things done, then you need to reinvest. It's so quick as soon as you get a bit of money in your drawer for leadership to say, oh, everybody's asking for repairs on their house, for distribution, blah, 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 blah. You need to reinvest that money back into your investments, okay? And I just want to make a word of caution here. It's a lot easier to buy an asset than it is to manage it. It is a lot easier to buy an asset than it is to manage it. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into a community, oh, we got to go invest. We heard that workshop says we got to go after the low-hanging fruit. They grab the wrong business or a decent business. They manage it poorly. They lose mega dollars on it. And now they're snake bitten about getting into businesses and investing because they've lost so much from past ones. So make sure that you get the right people to manage your assets. And finally, there are some dollars lying around right now that could be used for this. The latest one I'm finding are the gaming dollars. You know, we've all got that money coming in from BC right now. You hear about the things that we could do. I love the idea of investing some of these into some of these things that we've been talking about. And again, building up to it to the place where you actually now have some bigger projects that you can go after. So start small, work your way up. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Kim, I gave you enough time?
Yeah, I think in my opinion, you can never plan enough for your community needs. And once you kind of have a vision and invest in some long-term planning and the long-term vision of what your needs are, it's much easier to ask for things from other entities, whether it be how you procure construction for projects, or whether it be an ask to CMHC or Indigenous relations. I think the longer you spend on the upfront, less glamorous planning end of things, the more successful people likely are. And plans change and all that, but at least it helps also align everyone involved in that decision-making process on how to advance community's interest in relation to housing.
Great. Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you, Andrew, as well. And thanks to Jason, who unfortunately had to leave. I want to thank all three of our panelists today for your insight and your willingness to come on and answer some of these tough questions. And on behalf of the First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council of BC, we really appreciate your involvement today and your support. To all of the people who are participating and were on the call with us today, there will be the follow-up webinars that our regional engagement coordinators will be convening in the next few days. So look for the announcement on those and look to be able to get involved at a smaller, more community level to have some of these questions answered. All of the questions that are posed today that have been posed over the course of the webinar will be collected by us, and we will get answers for you. As you probably see on your screen, the follow-up poll has been put on the screen again, and we would ask very much if you would please take a moment to complete that. We rely upon that information to help guide us and direct us to creating webinars and information sessions and feedback that you require to help you do what you're doing in your communities. So on behalf of the FNIC BC, on behalf of our speakers, I want to thank you for your participation. Thank them again, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe and stay well.